In the dusty heart of Arizona Territory, 1847, where the wind carries whispers of Apache war cries and the scent of sage, a young woman named Ayanna stood defiantly before a weathered cowboy, her obsidian eyes blazing with contempt. The setting sun painted the mesa red as blood, and her words cut through the evening air like a Bowie knife through leather. "If you outrun the wild mustang, I'll marry you," she declared, her voice dripping with mockery that made the gathered Apache warriors chuckle behind their hands. The cowboy, a man called Jake Morrison from the Montana ranges, adjusted his worn Stetson and studied the magnificent black stallion pawing the earth nearby. This wasn't just any horse. This was Shadow Dancer, a legendary mustang that had never been caught, never been tamed, and had sent more than a dozen cowboys to their graves trying to break his spirit. But Jake had come to Fort Apache not just seeking work or adventure. He carried secrets darker than the approaching night, and this challenge would either fulfill his mysterious mission or destroy everything he'd worked toward for the past 5 years. The Apache Maiden's challenge echoed across the settlement, drawing curious onlookers from every corner of the fort. Soldiers paused their evening duties, traders abandoned their counting, and even the post commander, Colonel Harrison Blackwood, emerged from his quarters to witness what promised to be either spectacular entertainment or a tragic funeral. Ayanna was no ordinary Apache woman. She was the daughter of Chief Walking Bear, a leader whose diplomatic skills had kept peace between his people and the white settlers for nearly a decade. Her beauty was renowned across 3 territories, but so was her fierce independence and razor-sharp intellect. She had refused 17 suitors, both Apache and white, earning her the reputation as the untamable woman of the Southwest. Yet something about this particular cowboy's arrival had stirred unusual interest in her heart, though she'd rather die than admit it. Jake Morrison carried himself differently than other drifters who passed through Apache lands. His eyes held shadows of pain and purpose. His hands bore scars that spoke of violence beyond cattle drives. And when he looked at her, she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. The Mustang in question stood 30 yards away, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat, nostrils flaring as he sensed the tension in the air. Shadow Dancer had roamed the Superstition Mountains for 7 years, leading a herd of wild horses that had become the stuff of legend among both Apache and Mexican vaqueros. Stories claimed he could outrun the wind itself, leap canyons that would break other horses' necks, and possessed an almost supernatural intelligence that let him anticipate his pursuers' every move. The Apache considered him a sacred animal, a spirit horse that bridged the world between the living and their ancestors. For Ayanna to offer him as the test of worthiness was either the greatest honor she could bestow or the cruelest death sentence she could devise. Jake studied the magnificent creature with professional appreciation, noting the powerful hindquarters, the intelligent eyes, and the way the stallion positioned himself for maximum escape advantage. This wasn't going to be about speed alone. It would require strategy, endurance, and perhaps a little divine intervention. What neither Ayanna nor the gathering crowd knew was that Jake Morrison wasn't really a cowboy at all. He was a former Texas Ranger turned government agent, dispatched by territorial authorities to investigate a series of mysterious disappearances that had been plaguing the Arizona Territory for months. 17 people had vanished without a trace. Settlers, soldiers, even experienced Apache scouts, and the only clue linking the cases was a strange symbol carved into trees near each disappearance site. The symbol matched ancient Apache markings, but no living tribe member claimed knowledge of its meaning. Jake's superiors suspected either a rogue Apache war party or white outlaws trying to frame the peaceful tribes, and his mission was to discover the truth before the delicate peace treaty collapsed into bloody warfare. The challenge from Chief Walking Bear's daughter was an unexpected complication, but it might also provide the perfect cover for his investigation. By accepting Ayanna's challenge, he could remain close to the Apache community and observe their daily routines without raising suspicion about his true purpose. As Jake prepared for the race, checking his gear and studying the terrain, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Carved into a cottonwood tree at the edge of the settlement was the exact symbol he'd been tracking: 3 interlocking circles with an arrow pointing toward the sacred mountains. The carving looked fresh, perhaps only days old, and it was positioned so that anyone leaving the fort heading east would pass directly beneath it. This wasn't coincidence. Someone wanted the symbol to be seen, wanted to send a message that only Jake would understand. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 hidden beneath his leather vest, and his eyes swept the crowd for any face that didn't belong, any movement that seemed out of place. The disappearances were connected to this location, and now he was about to race into the very wilderness where people had been vanishing. The irony wasn't lost on him in pursuing the Apache maiden's challenge. He might be riding straight into the arms of the very criminal he'd been sent to capture. The crowd began placing bets as the sun settled lower toward the western horizon, creating long shadows that danced across the desert floor like ghostly fingers. Mexican traders wagered silver pesos, soldiers put up their monthly pay, and Apache warriors offered prized weapons and horses. The odds heavily favored Shadow Dancer, with experienced horsemen knowing that no man had ever successfully caught the legendary Mustang. But Jake noticed something peculiar in the betting patterns. Several men who looked like drifters and traders were placing unusually large wagers on his success, as though they knew something the others didn't. These weren't casual bets from curious onlookers. These were calculated investments from people who expected a specific outcome. Jake filed away their faces in his memory, noting their worn but expensive boots, their well-maintained weapons, and the way they positioned themselves with clear escape routes from the settlement. Something was definitely wrong here, and the horse race was beginning to feel more like an elaborate trap than a romantic challenge. Colonel Blackwood approached Jake with a mixture of amusement and concern etched across his weathered features. The post commander had been stationed at Fort Apache for 3 years, long enough to understand the complex dynamics between the Apache tribes and white settlers, but also long enough to recognize when something didn't fit the normal patterns. Jake Morrison had arrived claiming to be looking for ranch work, but his horse was too fine, his equipment too expensive, and his manner too confident for a simple drifter. Blackwood had fought in the Mexican War and could recognize a professional soldier when he saw one, regardless of what clothes the man wore. "Morrison," the colonel said quietly, "you sure you know what you're getting into? That horse has killed men before, and the desert's no place to be wandering alone these days. We've had some trouble with disappearances lately." Jake met the colonel's suspicious gaze steadily, knowing he couldn't reveal his true mission but needing to maintain his cover. "I appreciate the warning, Colonel, but I've handled difficult horses before. Sometimes a man has to take risks to get what he wants." The exchange was brief but loaded with unspoken understanding. Both men knew more than they were saying, and both recognized that the other harbored secrets. As preparations for the race continued, Jake noticed Ayanna watching him with an expression that seemed to shift between anticipation and something that looked almost like fear. She stood apart from the crowd, her traditional Apache dress moving gently in the evening breeze, her long black hair adorned with eagle feathers that marked her status as a chief's daughter. But there was something in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of looks he'd seen on the faces of other women who'd lost loved ones to violence, women who'd been touched by tragedy and learned to hide their pain behind masks of strength. When their eyes met across the dusty space between them, he saw a flicker of vulnerability that contradicted her earlier mockery. This wasn't just about proving her superiority over white men or maintaining her reputation as the untamable maiden. Something deeper was driving her actions, something that made her willing to risk her most sacred challenge on a stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. The Apache warriors began the traditional pre-race ceremony, chanting in their ancient tongue while burning sage and offering prayers to the spirits of the wind and earth. Jake understood enough of the language to catch fragments of their words. They were asking for protection, for wisdom, and for the spirits to guide the outcome according to divine will. Chief Walking Bear himself emerged from his lodge, a man of perhaps 50 years whose presence commanded instant respect from everyone present. His face was a roadmap of the American frontier, scarred by battles, weathered by decades under the desert sun, but still radiating the quiet authority that had kept his people alive through treaties and wars. When he looked at Jake, the cowboy felt as though he was being measured not just as a potential son-in-law, but as something far more significant. The chief's eyes held the same calculating intelligence Jake had learned to recognize in enemy commanders during his ranger days, and he realized that whatever game was being played here involved stakes much higher than marriage to his daughter. Walking Bear raised his hand for silence, and the gathered crowd immediately quieted. When the chief spoke, his English was perfect but carried the rhythmic cadence of his native tongue. The challenge is accepted, but let all who witness understand the true meaning of what happens here tonight. The wild Mustang represents the spirit of freedom that cannot be conquered by force, only earned through courage, wisdom, and respect for the natural world. If the white cowboy succeeds in his chase, he must prove worthy not just of my daughter's hand, but of understanding the sacred bond between man and horse, between the Apache people and the land that sustains us all. His words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Jake realized that this challenge was as much about testing his character as his riding ability. The chief's eyes met his again, and Jake caught something that looked like a warning mixed with hope, as though Walking Bear knew more about Jake's true purpose than he should, and was either trying to protect him or test him in ways that had nothing to do with horses or marriage. Shadow Dancer pawed the ground impatiently, his powerful muscles bunching and relaxing as he prepared for flight. The stallion's intelligence was evident in every movement. The way he tested the wind direction, checked the terrain for obstacles, and positioned himself for maximum advantage against his pursuer. Jake had chased wild horses before during his ranger days, and he recognized the signs of an animal that had learned to survive by being smarter than his enemies. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of outlasting the horse's initial burst of speed. Shadow Dancer would try to lead him into difficult terrain where experience and local knowledge would matter more than raw courage. The Mustang's black coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the fading light, and when he looked at Jake, there seemed to be an almost human understanding in those dark eyes, as though the horse knew exactly what was at stake and was prepared to make it as difficult as possible. As the final preparations concluded, Jake noticed that several of the suspicious-looking men from earlier had quietly disappeared from the crowd. This could be innocent. They might simply have lost interest in the spectacle. But his ranger instincts told him otherwise. People who placed large bets didn't usually leave before seeing the outcome, and their timing was too convenient to be coincidental. He memorized the faces of those who remained, noting which ones seemed too interested in his equipment, his horse, or the direction he would likely travel during the chase. If this was indeed a trap, it was an elaborate one that involved multiple participants and careful planning. The question was whether Ayanna was a willing participant or an unwitting pawn in someone else's game. Her earlier fear-tinged glances suggested she might know more about the danger than she was letting on, but whether she was trying to protect him or lead him to his doom remained unclear. The starting signal would be given when the sun touched the horizon, according to Apache tradition, and that moment was fast approaching. Jake swung into his saddle, feeling the familiar comfort of leather and steel, the reliable weight of his weapons, and the steady breathing of his mount, a sturdy quarter horse named Ranger who'd carried him through 3 years of dangerous assignments across the frontier. Ranger wasn't as spectacular as Shadow Dancer, but he was dependable, sure-footed, and had the endurance needed for long pursuits across difficult terrain. More importantly, he trusted Jake completely and would respond to the slightest pressure from his rider's knees or the subtle shift of weight that could mean the difference between success and disaster in a dangerous chase. As Jake gathered the reins and checked his gear one final time, he caught Ayanna's eye and saw something that made his heart skip, genuine concern mixed with what looked like regret, as though she wanted to call off the whole challenge but couldn't find the words or the courage to do so. The sun touched the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Chief Walking Bear raised his hand, held it for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, then brought it down with decisive force. "Let the chase begin!" His voice boomed across the settlement, and Shadow Dancer exploded into motion like a coiled spring suddenly released. The Mustang's initial burst of speed was breathtaking. He covered the first 100 yards in what seemed like heartbeats, his hooves barely touching the ground as he streaked toward the open desert. Jake spurred Ranger into pursuit, feeling the quarter horse's powerful hindquarters drive them forward. But even as they began the chase, he knew the real challenge was just beginning. Shadow Dancer wasn't running randomly. He had a destination in mind, a specific route that would test every aspect of Jake's horsemanship while leading him deeper into the wilderness where the mysterious disappearances had been occurring. The pursuit led immediately toward the Superstition Mountains, a jagged range of peaks and canyons that had earned their name from the countless legends surrounding their mysterious depths. Apache folklore claimed the mountains were inhabited by spirits that could drive men mad, while Mexican legends spoke of lost gold mines guarded by ghostly conquistadors. Jake knew the practical truth was almost as dangerous. The superstitions were a maze of narrow canyons, hidden arroyos, and treacherous rock formations that could trap or kill anyone unfamiliar with their secrets. Shadow Dancer was leading him into terrain where the Mustang held every advantage, but Jake had no choice except to follow. The challenge required him to keep the horse in sight until sunrise, and losing the trail now would mean admitting defeat before the real test had even begun. As they climbed into the foothills, Jake noticed that the hoofprints in the soft earth showed signs of other horses having passed this way recently, unshod ponies that suggested Apache riders, but also the distinctive marks of iron horseshoes that meant white men had been using this same route. The chase took on a surreal quality as they moved deeper into the mountain wilderness. Shadow Dancer seemed to flow across the landscape like liquid darkness, never missing a step even on the treacherous rock surfaces, while Jake and Ranger had to pick their way more carefully through the increasingly difficult terrain. The Mustang would disappear around a bend or behind a rock formation, only to reappear on an impossible-looking ledge high above, as though he was deliberately showing off his superior knowledge of the area. But Jake began to notice a pattern in the horses' route. They were following what appeared to be an ancient trail, probably used by Apache hunting parties for generations, that wound through the mountains in a way that avoided the most dangerous obstacles while still presenting significant challenges to anyone unfamiliar with the path. This wasn't random flight. Shadow Dancer was following a specific course that seemed designed to test Jake's resolve while leading him toward some predetermined destination. As the moon rose higher, casting silver light across the rocky landscape, Jake became aware that they were no longer alone in the mountains. He caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to detach themselves from rock formations and disappear again before he could focus on them clearly. These weren't animals. The movements were too purposeful, too coordinated. Someone was tracking their progress, probably multiple someones, and they were good enough at their job to remain almost invisible even to his trained eyes. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle, checking that it was secure and ready for quick use, while his mind raced through possibilities. Were these the men responsible for the disappearances? Apache warriors testing his courage? Or something else entirely? The fact that Shadow Dancer seemed unconcerned by the hidden watchers suggested either that the horse was accustomed to their presence or that they posed no immediate threat to the Mustang himself. The trail led to a narrow canyon that Jake recognized from his study of territorial maps, Devil's Canyon, a place where several of the recent disappearances had occurred. The canyon walls rose sheer on both sides, creating a natural funnel that would make escape difficult if this turned out to be an ambush. Shadow Dancer paused at the canyon entrance, looking back at his pursuer with what seemed like intelligence and perhaps even sympathy, before plunging into the narrow passage. Jake hesitated for a crucial moment, every instinct screaming that this was exactly the kind of trap he'd been warned about, but the challenge required him to follow wherever the Mustang led. He spurred Ranger into the canyon, his rifle now openly in his hands, eyes scanning the rim high above for any sign of movement. The narrow passage amplified every sound: the clatter of hooves on stone, the echo of Ranger's breathing, and something else that made Jake's blood run cold: the sound of other horses moving parallel to their course, hidden by the canyon walls but close enough that he could hear the distinctive ring of iron shoes on rock. Halfway through the canyon, Shadow Dancer stopped completely, standing motionless in a small clearing where several passages branched off in different directions. The Mustang's head was raised, ears alert, as though he was listening for something specific. Jake reined in Ranger, using the pause to study their surroundings more carefully, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. The canyon walls bore fresh scars from recent rockfalls that looked too uniform to be natural. Someone had been using explosives to reshape the passage, probably to create better ambush positions. More ominously, he spotted the remains of several campfires that couldn't be more than a few days old, and scattered around them were personal belongings that looked like they might have come from the missing persons he was investigating. A woman's torn shawl, a man's broken spectacles, a child's wooden toy items that painted a grim picture of what had been happening to travelers who ventured into these mountains. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring before being shattered by the sound of rifles being cocked on the canyon rim above. Jake found himself surrounded by at least a dozen men, their weapons trained on him from positions that made return fire nearly impossible. These weren't Apache warriors. Their clothing, weapons, and positioning marked them as white outlaws, probably the same gang responsible for the mysterious disappearances. Their leader emerged from a side passage, a tall man with cold gray eyes and the kind of smile that belonged on a rattlesnake. Well, the outlaw drawled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Looks like we caught ourselves another one, though I have to say, Mr. Morrison, or should I say, former Texas Ranger Morrison, you've led us quite a chase. Jake's heart sank as he realized the trap had been far more elaborate than he'd imagined. These men knew his real identity, which meant they'd been planning this ambush for weeks or possibly months, using information that could only have come from someone with access to government communications. Shadow Dancer wheeled around to face Jake, and for the first time since the chase began, the Mustang approached rather than fled. As the magnificent horse drew closer, Jake noticed something that made his understanding of the entire situation shift dramatically. There was a rider on Shadow Dancer's back, someone who had been lying flat against the horse's neck, invisible in the darkness until now. The figure sat up slowly, and Jake's jaw dropped as he recognized Diana. Her traditional dress replaced by practical riding clothes, a rifle in her hands but not pointed at him. "I'm sorry, Jake," she said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "But there are things about this situation you don't understand. These men have been holding my younger brother captive for 3 months, using him to force me to cooperate with their plans. The challenge, the race, bringing you here, it was all designed to capture you alive because they need information that only a government agent would have." The outlaw leader laughed harshly at Jake's obvious shock. "You see, Ranger Morrison, we've been intercepting territorial communications for quite some time now, thanks to our friends in certain government offices who find our operation profitable. We know you're here investigating the disappearances, and we know you have access to information about planned military movements, supply routes, and most importantly, the location of a very special government payroll shipment that's due to pass through Arizona territory next month. Your superiors sent you here thinking you were hunting us, but actually, we've been hunting you." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Jake's mind, the careful timing of his arrival, the challenge that seemed too convenient, the way certain men had bet on his success as though they knew the outcome in advance. He'd walked into a trap that had been months in the making, and now they had both him and the Apache maiden exactly where they wanted them. But as Jake studied Ayana's face in the moonlight, he saw something the outlaws had missed, a subtle hand signal in Apache Sign Language that she was making where only he could see it. She was indicating a hidden passage in the canyon wall, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and her eyes were telling him that despite appearances, she was not their willing accomplice. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. Ayana had been forced into this situation but had been trying to find a way to turn it to their advantage. Her earlier fear hadn't been about the race itself but about the danger she was leading him into, and her regretful glances had been genuine attempts to warn him without alerting the outlaws to her true intentions. Now she was positioned on Shadow Dancer in a way that suggested she was preparing for action, not surrender. The outlaw leader continued his gloating, apparently enjoying the moment of revelation. "The beauty of our operation is that everyone thinks the Apache are responsible for the disappearances. We leave enough evidence to point suspicion at the tribes, which keeps the army focused in the wrong direction while we conduct our real business. We've been using these mountains as a base for months, taking travelers, soldiers, even Apache scouts when they get too curious. Some we've ransomed back to their families, others we've kept for information, and a few," he shrugged with casual brutality, "well, some folks just aren't useful enough to keep alive. But you, Ranger Morrison, you're going to be very useful indeed. You're going to tell us everything you know about that payroll shipment, and then you're going to help us plan the perfect ambush." Jake kept his expression neutral while his mind raced through options. He was outnumbered and surrounded, but he wasn't helpless. His years as a Texas Ranger had taught him that desperate situations sometimes created unexpected opportunities, and Ayana's presence on Shadow Dancer suggested that he might have an ally in a position to help, The hidden passage she'd indicated could provide an escape route, but only if they could create enough distraction to reach it. More importantly, he was beginning to suspect that the outlaws' confidence in their trap might be their weakness. They believed they had complete control of the situation, which could make them careless about maintaining their advantage. "Before I tell you anything," Jake said carefully, "I want to see proof that the woman's brother is alive and unharmed. And I want to know why you needed such an elaborate trap when you could have simply ambushed me on the trail to Fort Apache." The outlaw leader's smile widened, apparently pleased by Jake's attempt to negotiate. "Fair questions, Ranger. The boy is alive because he's useful." The Apache listened to their chief's son, "and his cooperation keeps Walking Bear's warriors from getting too curious about our activities in these mountains. As for the elaborate trap, well, we needed you alive and we needed you isolated from any possible rescue. Killing a government agent brings too much attention, but having one disappear in Apache territory during a romantic pursuit? That just looks like another case of a white man getting in over his head with Indian ways." Just as the outlaw was finishing his explanation, the sound of approaching horses echoed from multiple directions around the canyon. Jake's first thought was that reinforcements were arriving, making their situation even more desperate, but the look of alarm on the outlaw leader's face suggested otherwise. "That's impossible," the man muttered, raising his rifle toward the canyon rim. "All the approaches are supposed to be watched." From the shadows emerged a force that Jake hadn't expected, a combined group of Apache warriors led by Chief Walking Bear himself, along with a squad of cavalry soldiers under Colonel Blackwood's command. The government agent realized that his mission had been more complex than his superiors had revealed. They'd been coordinating with Apache leaders to root out the real threat to territorial peace, using Jake's investigation as the visible part of a larger operation. Chief Walking Bear's voice boomed across the canyon with the authority of generations of war leaders. "You have taken my son, threatened my daughter, and brought violence to sacred Apache lands. The time for hiding in shadows is over." Colonel Blackwood added his own ultimatum. "By the authority of the United States Army, I order you to lay down your weapons immediately. This canyon is surrounded, and you have no avenue of escape." The outlaws found themselves caught in the same kind of trap they'd prepared for Jake, but the Apache and soldiers had chosen their positions more carefully, with overwhelming force and multiple escape routes cut off. But the outlaw leader wasn't finished yet. With the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, he grabbed Ayanna from Shadow Dancer's back, pressing a knife to her throat while using her as a human shield. "Maybe we can't escape," he snarled, "but I guarantee the Apache princess dies before any of you can reach her, and maybe that government payroll information dies with your ranger friend here." The standoff stretched taut as both sides calculated odds and options, weapons trained in multiple directions while Ayanna stood perfectly still in the outlaw's grip, her eyes meeting Jake's with a message he couldn't quite interpret. What happened next moved with the speed of striking lightning. Ayanna suddenly went limp in her captor's arms, a classic escape technique that caught the outlaw off guard for just a moment, long enough for Shadow Dancer to rear up and strike with his front hooves, knocking the knife from the man's hand while Jake drew and fired in one smooth motion, his bullet taking the outlaw leader in the shoulder and spinning him away from Ayanna. The canyon exploded into action as Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers engaged the remaining outlaws from multiple positions, the battle echoing off stone walls like thunder in the desert night. The fight was over quickly. The outlaws had been skilled at ambush and intimidation, but they lacked the training and coordination to stand against professional soldiers and experienced Apache warriors working together. Within minutes, the surviving gang members were disarmed and under guard, while army medics tended to the wounded on both sides. Jake found himself standing beside Ayanna in the sudden quiet that followed violence, both of them breathing hard from the adrenaline and relief of survival. As dawn broke over the Superstition Mountains, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The outlaw gang had been operating for nearly a year, using the mountains as a base for attacks on travelers, settlers, and military supply trains. They'd been funded by corrupt territorial officials who'd been selling information about government movements and using the profits to buy land at artificially low prices from families terrorized by the mysterious disappearances. The plan had been to blame everything on Apache uprisings, justifying military action that would drive the tribes off valuable mining territories. Colonel Blackwood explained the true nature of Jake's mission as they prepared to escort the prisoners back to Fort Apache. Your investigation was genuine, Morrison, but it was also designed to flush out the real conspirators. We've been working with Chief Walking Bear for months to identify the source of the trouble, and your arrival provided the perfect opportunity to force them into the open. The challenge from his daughter was part of the plan. We knew they'd try to use it as an opportunity to capture you, and we were ready for them. Jake looked at Ayanna with new understanding. So the whole thing was an act? The mockery, the impossible challenge. She smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and the expression transformed her face completely. Not entirely an act. Shadow Dancer really is impossible to catch. He's been my partner for 3 years, trained to respond to signals that look like natural horse behavior. But the mockery, that was definitely an act. I've been watching you since you arrived at Fort Apache, and I knew you were different from other men who'd passed through. My father and I hoped you might be the key to solving our problem. As they rode back toward the fort, Jake learned the rest of the story. Ayanna's younger brother had indeed been captured, but he'd been rescued 2 weeks earlier during a carefully planned Apache raid on the outlaw camp. The gang's continued belief that they held him had been crucial to maintaining their confidence in their plan. The mysterious symbols carved into trees had been Apache markers indicating surveillance points where warriors had been watching the outlaws' movements. Every aspect of what Jake had thought was a romantic adventure had actually been a carefully orchestrated military operation designed to end the threat to territorial peace. The payroll shipment the outlaws had been so interested in was real, but it was also bait, a deliberately leaked piece of information designed to reveal which territorial officials were passing secrets to the criminal gang. Jake's supposed knowledge about the shipment's route and timing was actually part of a disinformation campaign that would now lead to arrests throughout the territorial government. His superiors had been playing a deeper game than even he had realized, using his reputation and skills to create believable cover for a complex counterintelligence operation. But as they approached Fort Apache and the familiar buildings came into view, Jake realized that not everything had been pretense. The attraction he'd felt toward Ayanna had been genuine, and the looks they'd exchanged during the race and its aftermath suggested that her feelings might be equally real. The challenge that had brought them together might have been part of an elaborate deception, but the connection they'd discovered was based on truth. So what happens now? Jake asked as they rode through the fort's gates to the cheers of soldiers and Apache alike. The successful operation meant that peace between the tribes and territorial government was secure, at least for the moment, and Jake's mission was officially complete. But it also meant that his reasons for staying in Arizona territory were finished, and his superiors would soon be sending him to another assignment in another part of the frontier. Ayanna's answer surprised him. That depends on whether you're still interested in impossible challenges, Jake Morrison. Because I've got another one for you, trying to build a life together between two worlds, Apache and White, in a territory that's changing faster than anyone can predict. It won't be easy, and there's no guarantee of success, but it might be worth the attempt. Her smile was both invitation and challenge, and Jake realized that the race with Shadow Dancer had been just the beginning of a much longer and more complex pursuit. Chief Walking Bear approached them as they dismounted, his weathered face showing approval mixed with concern. You have both proven worthy of respect, he told Jake. But respect is only the beginning. If you wish to become part of our family, you must understand that the Apache way is not just about individual courage. It's about responsibility to the community, wisdom in leadership, and the ability to see beyond your own desires to the needs of future generations. The chief's words carried the weight of both blessing and warning, and Jake understood that earning the right to marry Ayanna would require more than winning a horse race or surviving a gunfight. Colonel Blackwood had his own concerns to express. Your work here has been exemplary, Morrison, but I have to ask, are you sure you want to give up your career as a territorial agent for life on an Apache reservation? The frontier is changing, and men with your skills and experience are going to be needed in a lot of places over the next few years. It was a fair question, and Jake knew it deserved serious consideration. His life as a government agent had given him purpose, excitement, and the satisfaction of serving a cause larger than himself. Trading that for the uncertainties of cross-cultural marriage and civilian life was not a decision to make lightly. But as Jake looked at Ayanna, at the fort that had become a symbol of cooperation between different peoples, and at the mountains where they'd all faced danger together, he realized that some opportunities only came once in a lifetime. The frontier might be changing, but it would continue to need people who could build bridges between different worlds, who could find solutions to problems that couldn't be solved with weapons alone. Perhaps his future lay not in chasing outlaws and solving territorial disputes, but in helping create the kind of community where Apache and white settlers could live together in mutual respect and prosperity. "I think," Jake said finally, "that I'm ready for a different kind of challenge, one that doesn't involve quite so much shooting, but might require even more courage in the long run." Ayana's smile lit up the morning like sunrise over the desert, and Jake knew that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would face them together. The race with Shadow Dancer had ended, but the real adventure was just beginning.